The small wooden cabin stood alone at the edge of the settlement, its weathered boards and slightly crooked chimney a testament to years of frontier life. Inside, a 12-year-old girl with tangled brown hair and worn-out boots swept the rough plank floor, pausing occasionally to push back a strand of hair that kept falling across her eyes. Rose wasn't like the other children who played near the fort. She carried a quietness about her, a solemn look that sometimes made adults glance away. It had been 8 months since the fever took both her ma and pa within days of each other, leaving her alone in the world except for Aunt Bess, who had reluctantly traveled from 2 settlements over to care for her brother's only child. "You missed a spot by the stove," Aunt Bess called from her rocking chair, not looking up from her mending. Her fingers, gnarled from years of hard work, moved quickly with the needle despite her failing eyesight. Rose nodded without speaking and swept the spot again, though it looked clean enough to her. She had learned that arguing with Aunt Bess only led to extra chores and fewer trips to the river, which had become her only real joy. The cabin felt smaller every day. 2 narrow beds, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, one never used now, a cast-iron stove that smoked when the wind blew from the east, and shelves lined with the few possessions they owned. The walls held no decorations except for a faded sampler Rose's mother had made as a girl, and her father's old hunting rifle mounted on pegs above the door. "I finished the sweeping. Aunt Bess, can I go collect herbs now?" Rose asked, leaning the broom against the wall. She knew the old woman relied on her for the wild plants that eased her aching joints. Aunt Bess squinted at the window, judging the time by the angle of light. "Be back before supper. And stay away from the crossing stones. The river's running high with the spring melt." Rose grabbed her worn canvas bag and slipped out the door before her aunt could think of another chore. The April air felt fresh against her face after the stuffiness of the cabin. She breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the scent of grass and distant pine. Fort Laramie lay about a mile to the north, its wooden walls visible across the rolling grassland. 26 families had built homes outside the fort's protection, forming a scattered community connected by dirt paths and necessity. Rose knew them all by name and story. The blacksmith whose laughter boomed across the settlement. The preacher's wife who sneaked sweets to children when her husband wasn't looking. The trapper who taught Rose a few words in Lakota and Cheyenne when Aunt Bess wasn't listening. As she walked toward the river, 2 boys from the settlement raced past on stick horses, kicking up dust. They waved but didn't slow down or invite her to join their game. Most children treated her differently now, as if being an orphan might be catching, like the fever that took her parents. "Just as well," she murmured to herself, though the words felt hollow. "Got work to do anyway." The path to the North Platte River wound through patches of prairie grass and early spring wildflowers. Rose knew exactly where to find the plants Aunt Bess needed. Wild mint for tea, yarrow for cuts, and willow bark for pain. Her mother had taught her the uses of each plant, knowledge passed down through generations of frontier women who couldn't always reach a proper doctor. The river came into view, its surface glittering in the afternoon sun. Spring runoff had indeed made it higher and faster than usual, but Rose knew its moods better than anyone. She'd been born in the settlement 12 years ago, and had grown up respecting the water's power while learning its secrets. She worked her way along the bank, filling her bag with plants and occasionally stopping to watch waterbirds dive for fish. This was the only time she felt truly peaceful, away from Aunt Bess's constant corrections, and the pitying looks from settlers who didn't know what to say to a child who had lost everything. As the shadows lengthened, Rose sat on a sun-warmed rock and dangled her feet just above the water's surface. From this spot, she could see across to the other side where the land belonged to the Lakota people. She'd never been across, of course. The invisible boundary between settler land and tribal territory was strictly observed by both sides, especially with tensions rising over broken treaties and encroaching miners. Yet Rose often wondered about the children on the other side. Did they play the same games? Did they miss their parents when they were away hunting? Did any of them ever sit at the river's edge and wonder about her too? A fish jumped nearby, startling her from her thoughts. The sun was getting lower and Aunt Bess would be cross if she was late. Rose gathered her bag and stood, brushing dirt from her faded blue dress. That's when she heard it, a sound almost lost beneath the river's constant voice. A soft crying from somewhere across the water. Rose froze, straining to hear. There it was again, definitely crying and definitely a child. She squinted against the setting sun, searching the opposite bank until she spotted movement under a cluster of cottonwood trees about 50 yards upstream, near the shallowest part of the river where large stepping stones created a natural crossing. Without thinking, Rose moved closer, following the bank upstream. The crying grew clearer, punctuated by words in a language she didn't understand. As she drew nearer to the crossing stones, she could make out a small figure huddled at the water's edge. A girl about her own age or younger, clutching her ankle. Rose hesitated, remembering every warning she'd ever heard about keeping to settler territory. Just last month, a farmer 20 miles south had lost his cattle to a raid, and the fort had doubled its patrols. Stories circulated through the settlement each night, some true, some exaggerated, all frightening. But the girl was alone and hurt. And she was just a child like Rose. "Hello?" Rose called softly, waving her hand. "Are you hurt?" The girl on the far bank looked up, startled. Fear flashed across her face, and she tried to stand, but collapsed back with a cry of pain. She wore a buckskin dress decorated with colorful beadwork, her black hair in 2 long braids. A small deerskin bag lay beside her. "I won't harm you," Rose said, though she knew the girl probably couldn't understand her words. She pointed to herself and then made gestures of peace, the way the friendly trapper had shown her. The girl watched warily but didn't try to flee again. Rose could see tear tracks on her dirt-smudged face. Whatever barriers existed between their peoples, pain and fear looked the same on either side of the river. Rose glanced back toward the settlement, then at the sun slipping toward the horizon. Aunt Bess would be furious, but she couldn't leave this girl alone as darkness approached. The nights were still cold enough to be dangerous, and an injured child alone might attract wolves or mountain lions. Drawing a deep breath, Rose set down her herb bag on the bank. Carefully, she stepped onto the first crossing stone, testing it to make sure it wasn't slippery from the higher water. Finding it secure, she continued across, hopping from stone to stone until she reached the far side, territory she had never set foot on before. The native girl watched her approach with wide, dark eyes that held both fear and hope. As Rose drew near, she noticed how the girl cradled her right ankle, which was swollen and beginning to bruise. Nearby lay a broken basket and scattered berries, the likely cause of her fall. Rose knelt down beside her and pointed to the injured ankle, raising her eyebrows in question. The girl hesitated, then nodded slowly and extended her leg slightly. "My name is Rose," she said, touching her chest. Then she pointed to the girl. The girl seemed to understand the gesture. "Winona," she replied softly, touching her own chest. Rose smiled, and after a moment Winona offered a small smile in return. In that instant, something shifted between them. A tiny bridge formed across a divide far wider than the river flowing beside them. As the first evening star appeared in the darkening sky, Rose made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She would help this girl, no matter what anyone in the settlement might say. Some things were more important than boundaries drawn on maps or the fears that adults carried. Some things were simply about being human. She had no way of knowing that by dawn, 30 warriors would stand at her barrier, or how her simple act of kindness would echo through both their communities for years to come. Winona's dark eyes followed Rose's every movement, a mix of caution and curiosity flickering across her face. The native girl's ankle had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, angry purple bruising spreading beneath her copper skin. She winced when Rose gently touched the area around the injury. "You fell gathering these?" Rose asked, pointing to the scattered berries. Though she knew Winona couldn't understand her words, sometimes the sound of a friendly voice was comfort enough. Rose had learned that during the long nights after her parents died, when she'd talk to herself just to break the silence. Winona nodded, then pointed upstream and made a walking motion with her fingers, followed by a tumbling gesture. She spoke a few words in her language, the sounds flowing like the river beside them. Rose recognized the universal story of a misstep and a fall. She nodded sympathetically. "How far is your family?" she asked, making a sweeping gesture meant to encompass people. Winona pointed toward distant hills that glowed orange in the setting sun. She held up her hand with fingers splayed, then closed and reopened it twice more. 15? Rose guessed. 15 people? Or 15? She mimicked walking. Winona shook her head and pointed to the sun, then dragged her finger across the sky and down to the horizon. 15 suns? Rose's stomach tightened. 15 days? That couldn't be right. She tried again, pointing to the sun and then making a sleeping gesture, repeating it. Winona held up one finger. 1 day. Rose breathed, relieved. The native girl's camp was only a day's journey away. But even that was too far for someone who couldn't walk. And night was coming fast now, the shadows stretching long across the ground. Rose bit her lip, thinking. She couldn't leave Winona here alone. Wild animals roamed at night, and the spring air still carried a bite of winter after sundown. But bringing a native girl back to the settlement? Aunt Bess would have plenty to say about that, and the others might be even less welcoming. Still, what choice did she have? Rose pointed to herself, then to Winona, and finally toward the settler side of the river. She mimed helping someone walk. Winona's eyes widened. She looked toward the settlement, then back at Rose. Fear crept across her face. No, no, Rose said quickly. Safe. You'll be safe. She hugged herself, then reached out as if embracing Winona, trying to convey protection. Just until morning. Then we'll figure out how to get you home. Whether Winona fully understood or simply trusted the kindness in Rose's eyes, she eventually gave a small nod. Rose smiled encouragingly and gathered the few berries that hadn't been crushed in Winona's fall, placing them in the native girl's deerskin bag. Then she slung both her herb bag and Winona's bag over one shoulder. Ready? She asked, crouching beside Winona. The crossing stones that had seemed so easy for Rose alone now presented a daunting challenge. Winona couldn't put weight on her injured ankle, which meant Rose would have to support her across each slippery stone with the river rushing below them. Rose helped Winona stand, letting the girl lean heavily against her side. They were nearly the same height, but Winona was lighter, her frame made wiry by a life of constant movement. Rose wrapped her arm firmly around Winona's waist while Winona draped her arm across Rose's shoulders. They hobbled to the edge of the water. The first stone seemed suddenly farther away than Rose remembered. The water level had risen even in the short time she'd been on the Lakota side, covering the edges of some stones. The current swirled around them, strong enough to knock over anyone who lost their footing. 1 step at a time, Rose murmured, as much to herself as to Winona. The native girl tensed as they approached the water but didn't pull back. Instead, she tightened her grip on Rose's shoulder and nodded once, her face set with determination. Rose stepped onto the first stone, testing it before helping Winona join her. The stone was barely big enough for both their feet. They teetered for a heart-stopping moment before finding their balance. Good, Rose encouraged. Now the next one. Stone by stone, they made their way across. Halfway through, Winona's foot slipped, and both girls lurched toward the rushing water. Rose's stomach dropped as she felt them tilting, falling. But then her free hand shot out and grabbed a jutting rock. Pain lanced through her fingers as they scraped against the rough surface, but she held on, steadying them both. Winona let out a small cry, more from fear than pain. Rose held her tighter. We're okay, she whispered, though her heart hammered against her ribs. We're okay. They paused, catching their breath. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, leaving only a faint glow in the western sky. The river looked darker, its voice louder in the gathering twilight. 3 more stones to go. Rose took a deep breath and moved forward again, more cautiously now. 1 stone, another, the final stone, and then blessed solid ground beneath their feet. They'd made it across. Both girls collapsed onto the grassy bank, breathing hard. Rose's arm ached from supporting Winona's weight, and her scraped hand stung. But a bubble of laughter rose in her throat, part relief, part triumph. Winona looked at her in surprise, then her own lips curved into a smile. She said something in her language that sounded like thanks. You're welcome, Rose replied, the simple phrase feeling deeply inadequate for what they'd just shared. After resting briefly, they began the slow journey toward the cabin. The distance that normally took Rose 10 minutes to walk stretched into nearly an hour, with Winona limping beside her. Night had fully fallen by the time the cabin's single window came into view, a square of yellow lamplight in the darkness. Rose paused at the edge of the cleared area around the cabin. My aunt, she said, pointing toward the light. She's... Rose searched for a way to explain Aunt Bess's likely reaction. She settled for making a stern face and wagging her finger. Winona studied the cabin, then glanced back the way they'd come. The night had grown cold, and she shivered slightly in her buckskin dress. "It'll be all right," Rose said, hoping she wasn't making a promise she couldn't keep. The door swung open before they reached it. Aunt Bess stood framed in the doorway, her thin frame rigid with anger and worry. "Rose Miller, where in heaven's name have you—" Her words cut off abruptly as she caught sight of Winona. The old woman's hand flew to her throat. "Good Lord above. She's hurt, Aunt Bess," Rose said quickly. "I found her across the river."
"She fell and hurt her ankle."
"She can't walk home." Aunt Bess's face went through a remarkable series of expressions: shock, fear, anger, and finally, a reluctant softening as her eyes fell on Winona's obviously painful injury. "Bring her in before someone sees," she said at last, stepping back from the doorway. "Heaven help us if the Jenkins boy spots her and runs telling tales to his father." Rose helped Winona inside, guiding her to one of the wooden chairs by the table. The native girl perched on its edge, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. Everything about the cabin, its square corners, solid walls, and strange objects, was foreign to a child who'd grown up in a teepee. Aunt Bess shut the door firmly and turned the key in the lock. "Of all the foolish, dangerous things you've done, Rose Miller, this surely tops them all." "I couldn't leave her there," Rose said simply. Aunt Bess pressed her lips together but didn't argue further. Instead, she filled a basin with water from the kettle warming on the stove. "Let's see that ankle," she said, her tone gruff but her movements gentle as she knelt before Winona. The native girl watched warily as Aunt Bess examined her injury. The old woman clucked her tongue. "A bad sprain, I'd say. Not broken, thank the Lord. But she won't be walking far on it any time soon." She began to clean the ankle with the warm water. Winona flinched at first but soon relaxed as the warmth eased some of the pain. Aunt Bess worked silently, applying a poultice of herbs Rose recognized from their own medicine supplies, then wrapping the ankle in clean strips of cloth. "She'll stay the night," Aunt Bess announced when she'd finished. "But come first light, we need to figure out how to get her back to her people before they come looking for her." A chill ran through Rose at those words. The settlers' greatest fear was a war party from any of the tribes whose land they now occupied. Though relations had been relatively peaceful in recent months, everyone knew that could change in an instant. "Thank you," Rose whispered to her aunt. Aunt Bess merely nodded, then turned to Winona. "Hungry?" she asked, miming eating. Winona nodded, a small smile touching her lips. While Aunt Bess served bowls of rabbit stew left from dinner, Rose cleaned her own scraped hand. She watched as Winona cautiously tasted the stew, then began to eat with evident hunger. The simple act of sharing food seemed to ease some of the strangeness between them. After eating, Rose made a pallet on the floor beside her own bed. She helped Winona lie down, propping her injured ankle on a folded blanket the way Aunt Bess had shown her. The native girl looked tiny and vulnerable lying there in her beaded dress, far from her family and surrounded by unfamiliar things. "Sleep now," Rose said softly, miming the action. "You're safe here." Whether Winona understood the words or just the kindness behind them, she nodded and closed her eyes. Within minutes, exhaustion claimed her and her breathing deepened into sleep. Rose climbed into her own bed but lay awake, listening to the night sounds outside, the hooting of an owl, the distant howl of a coyote, and beneath it all, the constant murmur of the river that had brought Winona into her life. Rose woke to the first hint of dawn creeping through the cabin's single window. For a moment she lay still, watching the familiar patterns of light slowly transform the rough-hewn ceiling above her bed. Then memory rushed back, the river, the crossing, Winona. She turned her head quickly to check the pallet beside her bed. Winona was still there, curled on her side with one arm tucked beneath her cheek. The native girl's face looked younger in sleep, the wariness gone from her features. Her long black braids had come partially undone during the night, leaving strands of hair across her face that fluttered gently with each breath. Rose slipped quietly from her bed, careful not to wake her guest. The cabin floor felt cold beneath her bare feet as she padded to the window. Outside, the world was washed in the pale blue light of early morning. Mist rose from the damp ground, wreathing the trees in ghostly white. No one else in the settlement would be stirring yet, except perhaps the baker who needed to light his ovens before sunrise. At the table, Aunt Bess already sat drinking her morning tea. The old woman looked as if she hadn't slept much. her face more lined than usual in the dim light of the oil lamp. "You've brought trouble to our door, child," she said softly, mindful of the sleeping girl. Rose poured herself a cup of tea and sat across from her aunt. "I couldn't leave her there." "No," Aunt Bess sighed. "I suppose you couldn't. You've got your mother's heart." She said this not as a compliment but as a statement of fact, perhaps even a diagnosis of an incurable condition. They sat in silence for a few minutes, sipping tea and listening to the early birds begin their morning songs outside. Then Aunt Bess set down her cup with a decisive click against the saucer. "Here's what we'll do. You'll stay here with the girl. Keep her out of sight, windows shuttered. I'll go to the fort and find that trapper, Hollister, the one who trades with the Lakota. He speaks their tongue. He can help us get word to her people." Hope flared in Rose's chest. Mr. Hollister was kind and fair-minded. If anyone could help, he would. A small sound drew their attention to the pallet where Winona was now awake and watching them with those dark, solemn eyes. She pushed herself up to sitting, wincing slightly as her movement jostled her injured ankle. "Good morning," Rose said, smiling. Winona nodded in response, then pointed to her wrapped ankle and made a questioning gesture. Rose moved to kneel beside her. "Better?" she asked, pointing to the ankle and then giving a thumbs up followed by a thumbs down question. Winona cautiously rotated her foot and gave a small, qualified thumbs up. The swelling had gone down somewhat overnight, but the bruising had darkened to a deep purple that spread across her entire ankle. "Hungry?" Rose mimicked eating again. At Winona's nod, Rose fetched a plate of cornbread left from the previous day and a jar of preserved apple butter. She watched as Winona cautiously tasted the unfamiliar food, then smiled at the look of surprise and pleasure that crossed the girl's face at the sweetness of the apple butter. Aunt Bess, meanwhile, had changed into her good dress, the dark blue one with only one mended tear, and was pinning her gray hair into a tight bun. "I'll be back as quick as I can," she told Rose. "Remember, keep her out of sight. The last thing we need is for someone like Old Man Taylor to spot her. He still blames the Lakota for his brother's death. Never mind that it was drink that killed him more than anything else." Rose nodded solemnly. Everyone in the settlement knew to avoid Mr. Taylor when he got to talking about savages and revenge. Most dismissed him as a harmless old man full of bluster, but Rose had seen the cold hatred in his eyes when a group of Lakota had come to trade at the fort last autumn. There was nothing harmless about that look. Aunt Bess paused at the door, her hand on the latch. "Be careful, Rose." For once there was no scolding in her tone, only genuine concern. "I will." After Aunt Bess left, Rose helped Winona to the table so she could finish her breakfast more comfortably. Then she fetched a basin of fresh water and a clean cloth. "Would you like to wash?" she asked, miming splashing water on her face. Winona nodded eagerly. Rose noticed how the native girl carefully observed everything in the cabin, her eyes lingering on objects that must seem strange to her. The iron stove, the glass oil lamp, the small mirror hanging on the wall. As Winona washed her face and hands, Rose wondered what it would be like to see her own familiar world through such different eyes. When Winona finished washing, she reached into the small deerskin bag she'd carried with her and pulled out a beautifully beaded hair ornament. She held it out to Rose. "For me?" Rose asked, surprised. Winona nodded, then pointed to Rose's tangled brown hair and mimed braiding. "You want to braid my hair?" Rose smiled, touching her own hair self-consciously. She usually just tied it back with a piece of string to keep it out of her face. Winona nodded again, more enthusiastically this time. Rose sat on the floor in front of Winona's chair, feeling the gentle tug as the native girl began to work her fingers through Rose's hair, carefully untangling the knots. There was something deeply comforting about the simple human contact. Since her mother died, no one had touched Rose with such care. As Winona worked, she began to hum softly, a melody unlike any Rose had heard before, with dips and rises that reminded her of wind moving through tall grass. The simple act of sharing this moment bridged the vast differences between their worlds more effectively than words ever could. Outside, the settlement was coming to life. Rose could hear the distant sounds of doors opening, animals being fed, children being called to breakfast. Ordinary morning sounds that now carried a hint of danger. What would these same neighbors think if they knew who sat in Rose's cabin, braiding her hair? Winona finished the first braid and secured it with the beaded ornament, then started on the second side. Her fingers moved skillfully, suggesting she'd done this many times before, perhaps for younger sisters or cousins in her camp. Rose was about to ask Winona if she had siblings, a question she would have to mime. Of course, when hoofbeats approached the cabin at a gallop, both girls froze. No one in the settlement rode that fast unless something was wrong. The rider pulled up just outside, and a moment later, a heavy fist pounded on the door. Rose Miller. You in there, girl? It was Mr. Jenkins, their nearest neighbor and the settlement's unofficial leader. Rose stood quickly, her heart pounding. She pressed a finger to her lips, signaling Winona to be quiet, then pointed to the small space between the bed and the wall. Winona understood immediately, sliding off the chair and crawling into the hiding spot despite her injured ankle. Only when Winona was hidden did Rose move to the door. Yes, Mr. Jenkins? The door swung open to reveal their neighbor's flushed face. Mr. Jenkins was still in his nightshirt with a coat hastily thrown over it, his gray-streaked beard uncombed. His eyes darted around the cabin interior. Where's your aunt? He demanded. She went to the fort to see Mr. Hollister about something, Rose replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. Is something wrong? Mr. Jenkins ran a hand through his disheveled hair. Indians, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as if they might hear him. A whole war party of them camped just beyond the North Ridge. Young Billy spotted them when he went to check his rabbit traps at first light. Rose's stomach clenched. Have they done anything? Not yet, Mr. Jenkins said grimly. But they're painted for war, Billy says. Got their faces all marked up with red and black. They've got spears and bows ready. Rose tried to swallow, but her mouth had gone dry. We're gathering everyone at the meeting house, Mr. Jenkins continued. Safety in numbers. Sent a rider to the fort for soldiers, but they might not get here in time if the Indians decide to attack. He looked around the cabin again. Get whatever valuables you can carry and come quick. No time to waste. I should wait for Aunt Bess, Rose stammered. Mr. Jenkins frowned. No time, girl. If she's at the fort, she's safer than we are. Now hurry up. After he left, Rose stood frozen in the middle of the room. From her hiding place, Winona emerged, her face pale with understanding even if she hadn't comprehended the exact words. Your people, Rose said, pointing in the direction of the North Ridge. She held up her hands with fingers spread. 10, she repeated the gesture. 20, then once more. 30 warriors, Winona's eyes widened. She spoke rapidly in her language, pointing to herself and making an urgent gesture toward the door. Rose understood. Winona believed the warriors had come looking for her. A terrible choice now faced Rose. She should go to the meeting house as Mr. Jenkins had ordered. Everyone would be there, and they'd notice if she was missing. But she couldn't leave Winona, and she certainly couldn't take her to the meeting house, where frightened settlers might see her as proof of hostile intentions. Nor could she let Winona try to reach the warriors on her own. The girl could barely walk, and if someone from the settlement spotted her limping across the open ground, they might shoot first and ask questions later. Rose looked out the window toward the North Ridge. No signs of movement yet, but they were out there. 30 Lakota warriors who'd come for the missing girl. 30 warriors who might think their chief's daughter had been taken against her will. The morning air bit at Rose's cheeks as she helped Winona hobble through the cabin doorway. Outside, the world seemed eerily still. No birds sang. No wind rustled the new spring leaves. Even the distant sounds of the settlement had fallen silent, as if everything waited, holding its breath. Lean on me, Rose whispered. Though she knew Winona couldn't understand the words, the native girl's arm tightened around Rose's shoulders as they made their halting way toward the small wooden fence that marked the boundary of Aunt Bess's property. They had barely reached it when the settlement bell began to ring, 3 sharp peals, followed by a pause, then 3 more. The alarm signal. Rose's heart jumped into her throat. From the direction of the meeting house came shouts and the sound of running feet. We need to hurry, she said, picking up their pace despite Winona's injured ankle. The native girl bit her lip against the pain but matched Rose's quicker steps. Rose had a plan, or the beginnings of one. They would head straight for the North Ridge. If they could get far enough from the settlement before being spotted, maybe they could reach the Lakota warriors and explain what had happened before. Anyone did something they'd all regret, but they'd only gone a few yards past the fence when Mr. Jenkins came running toward them from between two cabins, his rifle clutched in both hands. He skidded to a stop when he saw them, his eyes widening in shock. "Rose, what in God's name?" His gaze fixed on Winona and his face darkened with anger and fear. "Get away from her, girl." "No, Mr. Jenkins, please," Rose called out, tightening her grip on Winona, who had gone rigid beside her. "She's hurt. I was just helping her. The warriors, they're looking for her." More settlers appeared behind Mr. Jenkins, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Turner with her shotgun, old Mr. Taylor leaning on his cane, the blacksmith still wearing his leather apron. All of them stared at the two girls with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. "She's one of them," Mr. Taylor spat, pointing a gnarled finger at Winona. "Told you they were up to no good." "Please," Rose begged, looking from face to face, searching for understanding. "She fell and hurt her ankle. I found her by the river yesterday. I was just helping her get home." "You brought her into our settlement?" Mrs. Turner's voice rose with disbelief. "With all that's been happening at the Peterson place? Girl, have you lost your mind?" Rose didn't know what had happened at the Peterson farm, but from the looks on the adults' faces it was nothing good. She felt Winona trembling beside her, though whether from fear or the strain of standing on her injured ankle, Rose couldn't tell. "Back away from the Indian girl." "Rose," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice calmer now but no less firm. He raised his rifle, not pointing it directly at them but holding it ready. "We'll sort this out." "No," Rose said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I promised to help her." A murmur ran through the small crowd of settlers. Rose saw judgment in their eyes and something worse, disappointment, as if she'd betrayed them somehow. Then a new sound cut through the tension, hoofbeats approaching fast from the direction of the fort. Everyone turned to see Aunt Bess riding double with Mr. Hollister, the trapper. Behind them came 3 soldiers on horseback, their blue uniforms stark against the green gold of the spring grass. "Hold your fire," Mr. Hollister shouted as they drew near. "Everyone stay calm." The horses pulled up in a swirl of dust. Aunt Bess slid down from behind the trapper, her usually pale face flushed with exertion and worry. She rushed to Rose's side. "Oh, child," she breathed. "What have you done?" Before Rose could answer, a movement on the north ridge caught everyone's attention. Against the pale morning sky, dark silhouettes appeared, mounted figures, at least 30 of them arranged in a perfect line along the ridgetop. Even from this distance, Rose could see the eagle feathers in their hair, the spears and bows held at the ready. "Sweet Jesus," someone whispered behind her. Mr. Hollister dismounted quickly. "Nobody move," he ordered in the same tone he might use to calm a spooked horse. "Nobody raise a weapon." The settlers froze where they stood, watching as one of the mounted figures separated from the line and began riding down the slope toward them. The warrior sat tall and proud on his pinto horse, his face painted with red and black stripes that made his features seem carved from stone. A magnificent headdress of eagle feathers cascaded down his back, and around his neck hung a necklace of bear claws that clicked softly with each movement of his horse. Beside Rose, Winona made a small sound, part relief, part joy. She spoke a single word that sounded like, "Otway." "Her father," Mr. Hollister translated quietly. "That's Chief Grey Wolf." The warrior, the chief, stopped his horse about 20 paces from the group of settlers. His dark eyes scanned the scene, taking in the armed men and women, the soldiers with their hands resting near their holsters, and finally, the 2 girls standing apart from the others. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Rose could feel the weight of the chief's gaze on her, assessing, judging. She lifted her chin and met his eyes directly, refusing to look away even as her knees threatened to buckle beneath her. Then Winona called out, her clear voice carrying across the open space between them. She spoke rapidly in her language, pointing to her wrapped ankle, then to Rose, and making the same crossing motion Rose had used to explain their journey across the river. Chief Grey Wolf listened without expression. When his daughter finished speaking, his gaze returned to Rose, somehow even more intense than before. He said something to Mr. Hollister, who had cautiously moved forward to stand between the 2 groups. "The chief asks if you are the one who helped his daughter cross the water," the trapper translated. Rose swallowed hard. "Yes," she said simply. "She was hurt. I couldn't leave her there alone." Mr. Hollister relayed her words. For the first time, a flicker of something other than stern authority crossed the chief's face, a hint of surprise, perhaps even respect. He spoke again, longer this time. He says his son saw you help Winona across the river, Mr. Hollister translated. The boy rode through the night to bring word that his sister had been taken by settlers. The chief gathered his warriors at first light to come for her. A chill ran down Rose's spine at how easily things might have gone terribly wrong. If Mr. Jenkins or one of the others had fired a shot in panic, if the warriors had attacked, thinking Winona was being held against her will. The chief spoke once more, his deep voice carrying across the space between them. He asks why you helped his daughter when your people and his are enemies, Mr. Hollister said. Rose blinked in surprise. We're not enemies, she said. Then more softly, at least I'm not. When Mr. Hollister translated this, murmurs rose from both sides, disapproving from some of the settlers, curious from the warriors now watching from the ridge. Chief Grey Wolf studied Rose for another long moment. Then, to everyone's surprise, he swung down from his horse in one fluid movement. Standing on the ground, he seemed less impossibly tall but no less commanding. He spoke a few words to his daughter, who answered with a nod. Slowly, deliberately, he began walking toward Rose. Stay where you are. Chief, one of the soldiers called out, his hand moving to his pistol. No, Rose cried. Please let him come. Mr. Hollister held up his hands. Easy now. Let's not make this worse. The chief continued forward, his eyes never leaving Rose's face. The settlers and soldiers tensed, but no one moved to stop him. When he reached the girls, he knelt down to examine his daughter's wrapped ankle. His weathered fingers gently probed the bandage Aunt Bess had applied, and he nodded with what appeared to be approval. Then he rose and looked directly at Rose. Up close, she could see that beneath the stern exterior and war. Paint was a father worried about his child, no different from how her own pa had looked when she'd fallen from the apple tree 2 summers ago and broken her arm. The chief spoke, his voice unexpectedly gentle. He asked your name, Mr. Hollister translated from a few paces away. Rose, she replied. Rose Miller. The chief nodded slowly as if committing the name to memory. Then he reached beneath his buckskin shirt and removed something. From around his neck, a small leather pouch, decorated with intricate beadwork, in blue and white patterns that reminded Rose of flowing water. He held it out to her. A medicine pouch, Mr. Hollister explained, his voice tinged with awe. It's a powerful gift, a sign of protection and respect. Rose hesitated, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. Then, with hands that trembled slightly, she accepted the gift. Thank you, she whispered. The chief spoke again. At length this time, Mr. Hollister translated. He says that among his people, there is a story of a spirit who appears as a small girl to test the kindness of strangers. Those who help the spirit are blessed with good fortune. Those who turn away face hardship. He says perhaps the Great Spirit sent his daughter to test the settlers, and only one passed the test. Rose felt her cheeks grow warm with a mixture of embarrassment and pride. The chief turned and called out to his warriors on the ridge. One broke away from the line and rode down to join them, leading a second horse. The chief spoke to his daughter, who nodded and turned to Rose. To everyone's surprise, Winona threw her arms around Rose in a tight embrace. Rose hugged her back, suddenly fighting tears. In just one day, this girl from another world had somehow become a friend she didn't want to lose. 3 months had passed since the morning when 30 Lakota warriors stood at Rose's fence. Summer now draped the prairie in golden green, wildflowers nodding in the warm breeze that swept down from the distant mountains. The days stretched long and languid, the sun hanging in the sky until well into the evening. Rose sat by the river, her bare feet dangling in the cool water. The same river that had once been a boundary now felt more like a connection, a shared place between 2 worlds. She wore her hair in 2 braids, the blue and white beaded ornament that Winona had given her fastened at the end of one. Around her neck hung the medicine pouch from Chief Grey Wolf, its soft leather worn smooth from her habit of touching it for comfort. Thought I might find you here, a voice called from behind her. Rose turned to see Aunt Bess making her way carefully down the sloping bank, a basket over one arm. The old woman moved more slowly these days, but her eyes were brighter, her face less pinched with worry than it had been in the days after Rose's parents died. Just cooling my feet, Rose said, smiling as her aunt settled beside her with a soft grunt of effort. Brought us some lunch, Aunt Bess said, opening the basket to reveal cornbread, dried apple slices, and 2 jars of fresh buttermilk. Thought we might have ourselves a little picnic before we head to the trading post. Rose's heart quickened. So we're still going? Said we would, didn't I? Aunt Bess replied, though her tone held no real sharpness. Besides, Mrs. Turner says they brought some fine cloth this time. Might get enough for a new dress for you. You're growing like a weed. They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching dragonflies skim across the water's surface. A family of ducks paddled by, the mother leading a line of fluffy ducklings that left tiny ripples in their wake. Never thought I'd see the day, Aunt Bess said suddenly, shaking her head. What day? Rose asked, though she suspected she knew what her aunt meant. The day when I'd be heading to a trading post to barter with the very people I used to fear might kill us in our sleep. Aunt Bess gave a short laugh. Life surely takes some unexpected turns. Rose smiled, running her fingers over the smooth surface of the medicine pouch. Pa used to say that fear is just not knowing someone well enough. Your pa was a wise man, Aunt Bess said softly, though I'm not sure even he would have been brave enough to help a Lakota child cross that river. She reached out and patted Rose's hand. You've got a special kind of courage, child. The kind that changes things. Rose felt her cheeks warm at the rare praise. She wasn't sure she deserved credit for what anyone with a heart would have done, but she couldn't deny that her simple act had indeed changed things. Not just for her and Winona, but for the entire settlement and the Lakota band. The peace sign that Chief Grey Wolf had ordered painted on their fence post, a circle divided into 4 parts, each filled with a different color, had stood as a silent guardian over their cabin. In the weeks that followed, more signs appeared around the settlement as the chief extended his protection to other families who showed friendship to his people. Mr. Jenkins, surprisingly, had been among the first to change his ways. Perhaps it was the shock of seeing the chief kneel to examine his daughter's injury with such gentle care. Or perhaps it was simply the realization that the savages he'd feared were people with the same loves and worries as himself. Whatever the reason, he'd taken the lead in establishing more formal trading relations with the Lakota band. Even old Mr. Taylor had softened somewhat, though he still muttered occasionally about the way things used to be. We should get going if we want to reach the trading post by noon, Aunt Bess said, gathering the remains of their lunch. Rose helped her aunt to her feet, then slipped on her moccasins, a gift from Winona during her first visit back to the settlement. The soft deerskin felt more comfortable than Rose's old leather boots ever had, especially in the summer heat. They walked together along the river path before turning toward the settlement. As they passed the cabin, Rose touched the painted sign on their fence post, a habit she'd developed over the months. The colors had faded slightly under the summer sun, but the meaning remained as strong as ever. The trading post had been set up in a clearing at the edge of the settlement, roughly halfway between the fort and the hills where the Lakota band made their summer camp. It wasn't much to look at, just a collection of wagons, makeshift tables and canvas awnings, but to Rose, it represented something remarkable, a place where 2 different worlds could meet in peace. As they approached, Rose spotted familiar faces from both communities. Mr. Hollister, the trapper, moved between groups, his knowledge of both languages making him an invaluable mediator. The fort's commander stood talking with Chief Grey Wolf, their heads bent together over what looked like a map. Nearby, the blacksmith demonstrated the use of a metal tool to a young Lakota brave, their lack of shared language overcome by gestures and smiles. And there, helping an elderly Lakota woman examine a bolt of calico cloth, was Winona. The native girl looked up as if sensing Rose's presence. Her face broke into a wide smile, and she said something to the older woman before limping quickly toward them. The injury had healed well, though Winona still favored her right leg slightly when she walked. The 2 girls met in the middle of the clearing, embracing as naturally as if they'd been friends all their lives rather than girls from worlds that had long been separated by mistrust. Rose, Winona said, one of the few English words she'd learned over the summer. She touched the beaded ornament in Rose's hair, clearly pleased to see it still being worn. Winona, Rose replied, then added the Lakota greeting that Winona had taught her, How kola. Hello, friend. Winona laughed with delight at hearing her language from Rose's lips. She took Rose's hand and pulled her toward a blanket spread with beautifully crafted items. Beaded moccasins, small carved animals in intricately woven baskets. My mother, Winona explained in halting English, gesturing to the dignified woman who sat working a new pattern of beads onto a piece of buckskin. Rose nodded respectfully to Winona's mother, who smiled and inclined her head in return. The woman said something to Winona, who translated as best she could. She says, "You have good heart. Like the river." Winona made a flowing motion with her hand. "Thank you," Rose said, both to Winona and her mother. "Your daughter also has a good heart." As Aunt Bess joined them and began examining the craftwork with appreciative murmurs, Rose felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Chief Grey Wolf standing there, his face solemn but his eyes kind. Gone was the war paint he had worn that day at dawn, replaced by simpler markings that Rose had learned indicated his status as chief and spiritual leader. He spoke briefly, looking directly at Rose. Winona translated, "My father says the river brings life to all people. Those who understand this wisdom will never truly be enemies." Rose nodded, understanding the deeper meaning in his words. The river that physically divided their lands could also be the very thing that connected them. Just as Winona's injury had created an unexpected bridge between two worlds, the chief reached out and lightly touched the medicine pouch that hung around Rose's neck. He spoke again. "He says you carry his protection always, but more important, you carry the spirit of the river. Always moving, always connecting. Never stopped by stones in your path." Rose felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the chief's words and the truth they contained. She had never thought of herself as particularly brave or special. She had simply done what seemed right when she found an injured girl by the river, yet somehow that one moment of kindness had rippled outward, changing everything. As the afternoon continued, Rose watched the people of both communities engage in trade and conversation. Children who had once been taught to fear each other now chased one another between the tables, their laughter a universal language. Women exchanged recipes and remedies, finding common ground in their roles as caretakers and healers. Men who might once have raised weapons against each other now raised cups and shared toasts. Not everything was perfect, of course. Old suspicions occasionally resurfaced. Cultural differences led to misunderstandings that required patience to resolve. The history between settlers and native peoples couldn't be erased by a single season of peaceful trading, but it was a beginning. Later, as Rose and Aunt Bess walked home with their purchases, calico for a new dress, beads for Rose to learn Lakota beadwork under Winona's teaching, and herbs that Winona's mother had recommended for Aunt Bess's aching joints, they paused by the river crossing where it had all started. "You know," Aunt Bess said thoughtfully, "your mother used to say that the bravest thing isn't doing what seems big and important. It's doing the small right thing when it would be easier not to." Rose nodded, thinking of that moment when she'd first spotted Winona on the far bank. How simple it would have been to walk away, to tell herself it wasn't her problem. "I think," Rose said slowly, "that sometimes the river puts someone in our path for a reason." Aunt Bess smiled, a rare full smile that softened her entire face. "I think you might be right about that, child."